and welcome everybody, the first of the new year. However, as Matt and I were just sharing before we came on live, some things don't feel like they've changed. As in, here in the Wells, we are still without water. But there we go. Anyway, welcome guys. It's fabulous to have you back with us for this conversation in the new year. And so welcome. How are we all?
Jolly good, thank you.
Good, thanks. Thanks, Laura. Good.
And water is clearly plentiful with you guys.
Well, we sometimes have trouble with ours this time of year, Laura, because I have a private water supply that comes from a spring on my land that goes to a water tank up the back and then has to make its way to the house. This time of year, it does freeze occasionally. So I have had some intermittent water supplies, but I've got a very good excuse. Kent water, less so.
Yeah, absolutely. But hey, here we are, back together, the team, as it were, talking about, I don't know, responsibility, presence under pressure. How do we manage that where we can still have a space? And, you know, I guess, I know it's not about blame, it's not about labels, it's just a recognition that the world as it is today is busy, it's noisy, there's systems creaking. You know, there's one system particularly creaking around water, as we have just commented on. But within that, people still have to operate. And it becomes very easy to get lost in that system with no space for voices to be heard. And therefore silence becomes much, much easier because we just want to get on with it. But the challenge with that is when voices aren't heard, don't have a space, it leaks out somewhere. And invariably, it leaks out in those places that we don't always necessarily want them to leak out in, but in the places where we feel safe for that to do it. So I guess that's kind of like the general theme behind, you know, us coming together this evening and having that conversation, because that silence can be really damaging. And I guess I'm going to throw it to you guys as to, you know, how you see that having an impact in your worlds, in the work that you do with the people that you work with, because invariably, as I say, it leaks out somewhere, and that silence isn't just silence. It's not nothing. It's not apathy. So I'm gonna throw it to you, Mark. What are your thoughts?
Is it silence as complicity? What I'm thinking there, Laura, is I was doing a couple of sessions yesterday with large groups of construction workers, and there was probably about, in total over the two sessions, probably about 500 lads in the room, and I was talking to them about mental health and mental strength. But I was using Menti. I don't know if you know the Menti system, where you can ask questions and people can take out their phones and they can answer the questions on that, and it comes up on the screen, then the information, whatever you're doing. And one of the things I did ask was, you know, how do you negatively cope with stress? And I had highlighted lots of different ways that we do this. And then, you know, the answers are people were popping up on the screen now. It's a risk if you ask 500 construction workers and you give them a free form text or say whatever they want and that's going to come up on a screen. There was a few answers that were not what I wanted to see on the screen, right? but what did come up a number of different occasions was I get silent, I withdraw, I pull away. And that came up, and this is a way of coping with stress. And is that very much different in a situation where we know there's something wrong? We know, you know, that while we should take certain action, but instead we withdraw and we become silent. And as a part of that, we become complicit in our silence. But it's easier to be silent because not being silent requires that bit of courage or that bit of honesty or that bit of bravery. And it was interesting, and why this was men talking about their mental health, but from the perspective of as tool. We use silence as a tool, because it's easier for us to do that, to come withdrawn. And I use myself as an example. A colleague pointed this out to me at work years ago. She came up to me one day and she said, "Jesus, Mark, you're stressed." I was like, "What do you mean I'm stressed? I'm not stressed." I know you're stressed because you're really quiet and you're never bloody quiet. And I was like, okay, that was really interesting. And because I didn't realize that about myself. And when she highlighted to me, I was like, oh yeah, so I use quiet as a way to cope. I think if I stay here, maybe the problem will go away and I can cope with it, And so I think for a lot of us men, we're complicit by being silent because silence is something we use to cope in a situation because we do not want to be confronted. We don't know how to put ourselves out there. We don't know how to deal with it.
And that's a really good point. And I'll be honest, I recognize it in myself. I know when my brain is working, I talk about my curly whirly brain, but when it is in that full on mode, I go into silent, because I'm internally processing, but I don't recognize the outer impact. And I suppose the thing that I've gone to in my mind is that word impact, is the impact to people around you as to how they then feel. And your example is perfect, Mark, in how somebody else had recognized that shift, but how does that change other people feel? Do they feel safe? Do they not feel safe? Because suddenly this person who is normally quite conversational and part of the activity is stepped back, and then people suddenly going, I don't feel safe anymore. I don't know, Matt, what's your experience? Is it something that you recognize, or?
Yeah, and I was going to partially agree and slightly disagree with Mark in that I recognize that silence under stress. I think that is a very clear coping mechanism. I guess where I was going to suggest that it was maybe slightly different is I don't think it's, and almost to your point, or I don't think it's a uniquely male thing. I think same for women as well. And in the world that I work in, where that silence impacts, it only serves to increase the issue, because it means that these things are not being discussed. And I think when we look at this context, violence against women and girls, female safety, etc., I think again that silence is dangerous, because it means those conversations aren't happening, which means that from a female perspective, it's almost like the message is, well, you're on your own in this one. And that's when the behavior of the self-policing comes in that we've spoken about in previous episodes, where a woman feels like she can't walk down that street at that time, and she can't wear that item of clothing, and she can't do this because that risk has been increased by silence, by a lack of conversation. And so I think it's about the risk just increases. It sort of, the silence is a protection mechanism, but actually rather than protecting it really increases that risk.
It almost amplifies it in some respects, because I think when that silence is there, assumption steps in, and we start, other people's brains just go into overdrive. What could be going on? I don't, I'm guessing. I guess bad English, but you know what I'm saying. People start stepping into this guessing game of what could be really going on, and that's really dangerous when you're not actually having that communication. Dan, I mean, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, and that is the big problem with silence, is people fill in the gaps, right? And, we're talking about self-abandonment here today. And I imagine many people stay silent because they feel like it's safe. Matt used the word risk there, right? It sometimes feels risky to speak out. And what Mark often talks about is that having the courage to do the right thing, even if it's unpopular. And sometimes it feels safer to do nothing and say nothing, and as Mark alluded to at the start there, to kind of withdraw, right? But then the trouble is, when you do that, when everybody's silent, we don't realize we're the majority. So we then give the power and the microphone and the platform to the loud people, those that have got something to say, those that have got something to push. And then those of us that have withdrawn silently see those loud people and go, well, that's not me. Oh, no. Right. That's even more reason now to shut up. When actually, because we've talked about this before, Laura, the 4 in 5, the 80%. If we're all silent, nothing changes. If we all stand together and say, we want a less violent world, we want our women and girls to feel safe, we want all of us as men to be allies and create a world where women don't have to think about where they go, what time of day it is, what they're wearing, carrying keys in between their hands and all that, right? The vast majority of us, we don't want that. So it's time to stop being silent. It's time to stand together and all say that. Because if we are being silent and we are withdrawing, we are abandoning ourselves. We are abandoning our ethics, our morals, our values. And all that's going to do is build self-resentment. You're going to end up hating yourself, which is going to turn you into a not very nice person. Because when you don't trust yourself anymore, you don't like yourself anymore, you start to behave in a way that you don't really want to behave.
Yeah. And that's so true. It almost becomes self-fulfilling. You set out on this path and you kind of slowly kind of end up in isolating yourself because you've not spoken out for the fear of getting it wrong, kind of maybe being a bit explosive when you first say it because you just don't know where to start. But I think it sometimes actually starting somewhere is part of the conversation. If we're not careful, it's too easy for that to blow out of all proportion. And actually then, actually what you end up with is something far, far worse that people around, and women and young girls feel then really apprehensive about. And some of the youth voices that I listen to, this will say, well, I don't know who a trusted adult is. How will I know? And, if somebody is being quiet, if men and young men are being quiet, how can you build up that sense of, I can trust this individual? You can't, because your brain is filling, to use your words, Dan, to filling in the gaps. And I think that really, really matters. I think it's, there is no miracle solution to it. This is not about, saying that there is a wrong or a right and that, there is a fix here. It's just recognizing the conditions that, our modern world actually puts on all of us, but the impact that can have if we have no safe spaces where we're able to talk openly with it. And I guess, equally especially, in systems like, and when I say systems, I mean, effectively in going to work, I mean, you've all worked in a corporate or in an organization. I know you don't now, but you all understand that. And I know many of your clients will equally be still in those organizations. And I'm sure many of them say, well, how do I deal with this? And how do I not, load it onto my partner, my wife, my children, all the rest of it? I'm sure, Dan, this must come up often in conversations that you have.
Yeah, I mean, it does. And, in this world where we live now, this cancel culture, a lot of the guys I talk to are worried about saying the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person, offending somebody, upsetting somebody. And so therefore they stay silent when actually they'd rather speak up, but they're just not sure how or where or when's appropriate or how's appropriate or what's appropriate. And I think that's why it's so important that we're having a conversation like this here today with 3 white blokes, right, who are all here to hold our hands up and say, we don't know, but what we are doing is we are happy to step forward, to step up and to talk about it. And, because that's the start, right? Is the talking and the listening. Because we're all in this together. We're all in this together. We've got to stop pointing the finger. We've got to stop blaming other people. And we've got to take a bit of responsibility for ourselves. And when we feel moved to act and moved to say something, we've got to trust ourselves that we're not going to offend people, then we're not going to upset people, and you know, recognize that most people are very understanding. Most people will really appreciate the fact that you've stepped forward. That, you know, what I've noticed in my work is everybody sat around waiting to be led, wanting somebody else to take the risks and do the thinking for them. The time has come where that's got to stop. If we want something to change, we've all got to do something about it. We've all got to follow our hearts and follow our conscience and follow our inner guidance, which is going to take us to the places we want to be, to having the conversations we want to have, so that we can start getting this stuff on the table and talking about it. Because brushing it under the carpet, saying it's not all men, saying it's not me, Gov, that just doesn't cut it anymore.
No. I think you're right. Unless, you know, I mean, you know, just as even this, you know, 15 minutes of conversation thus far, it's like recognizing that even in some of the examples that Mark's given, I've experienced the same and have been challenged the same. You know, I think when we realize that similarity, then actually it feels actually not quite the chasm that so many people think it is that we have to bridge. And it starts with having those conversations. And if we're not prepared to have a conversation and that we stick with the silence, then to your point, nothing is going to change. You know, from your perspective, Mark, why do conversations like this really matter? Global question.
yeah, it's a large one there, right? I'm going to just read from my essay that I wrote on this topic.
Your thesis.
just something that was kind of come to mind as you were speaking there earlier, and as Dan was speaking, and it's something that I say to my girls, to my kids, and because I know what teenage boys are like, because I happened to be one once upon a time, and so I say to them, don't, and we're talking about the need for conversation, right? But it sounds like to me, it's not just words we need. It's not just conversation. It's conversation as action we need. You know, it goes beyond just the words. It's the words as action. Because I'm always saying to them, you know, that don't just listen to what someone says. Follow what they do. You know, watch their actions. Because in their actions, you'll see the truth of the person, not in the words that they use. Because we say a lot of different things and what's actually true about what we say as opposed to what we actually carry out and do. And I think that's why the conversation is important, because we don't know how to follow through, because we don't know what way to follow through. Because if we're not having the conversation, and to Dan's point about where's the leaders, you know, we're looking for a leader. We can follow the words through to the next level of whatever we have to learn. We can follow that direction through, because the words have enough power in them. They become action words. And that's why the conversation has to happen, because it has to open the road, has to open the channel for us to actually start going in that direction and moving in that direction and shifting consciousness in that direction and shifting an entire cultural awareness into that direction. And that's how powerful they need to be. And that's how strong and how they're already valid, but how absolutely intentional they need to be in order to actually shift that and move that and change that.
And it's so true, because, you know, otherwise the words are effectively hollow. You know, it's meaningless. I guess, you know, and I suppose, Matt, a question for you really, you know, hearing what Mark's saying, and, you know, and I'm absolutely with you, Mark, you know, why does action feel so risky for so many though?
Why is action so risky? Because it's kind of putting your head above the parapet a little, isn't it? I mean, in terms of what you were saying before, the tangent there with the corporate career that we've all been a part of is, I think, quite an interesting one. You know, I come from the world of banking, and, you know, silence is tacit agreement. It's complicity. It's, you know, it's saying that's okay because I'm staying silent. And, you know, you see court cases around banks and around, you know, fraudulent activity in banks, and the defense of it wasn't me, I didn't say anything, I wasn't part of it, isn't enough. And that's not to, in this circumstance, try and shame and guilt and criticize, but to say it's a really good parallel to think about, that, you know, that silence isn't okay, because it's not neutral. Like, I think there's a feeling that silence is neutral, whereas putting your head above the parapet and saying something isn't neutral. Well, actually, silence isn't neutral either, because it's those who aren't silent, which isn't necessarily what we want to be listening to, and it gives power to those taking actions that we don't necessarily agree with. But that silence is, to use the corporate context, that it's complicity. So your question around why is it difficult, I think in the same way that whistleblowing in corporate is difficult. You know, you almost, it feels like you're creating a risk for yourself. You know, everyone's kind of blindly going on in this direction, and if you go, oi, hang on, then you might well have a lot of people, and I think the perception is you might well have a lot of people going, pipe down.
Yeah.
Shush, you're creating friction and noise where there doesn't need to be friction and noise. Well, actually, you know, if you follow that on, you might end up with a £300 million trading incident because you didn't say hang on. So it's not friction and noise where it's not required. It's actually, it is required.
And that's so true. I mean, you know, something that was going through my head as you were talking there, Matt, was that there's a phrase that says you cannot not communicate. So even in your silence, you're communicating something. And you know, and I think the real risk for me is, as I say, you know, if you hold something in as silence, you cannot not bleed it out, for want of a better way of describing it, somewhere, whether it's in a relationship, whether it is because you got angry in the car and shouted at somebody because that, you know, that person didn't matter, because actually I'm under all this stress and anxiety because I'm not allowed to have a space at work to be able to talk about it. But it's going to leak out, it's going to bleed into something, whether it's, you know, a close relationship where you feel safe enough to say things, but somewhere, if that's not shared openly, I think there is an inherent concern that people around you pick up on it, and, you know, start carrying it, because you're effectively walking on eggshells around that individual, because you don't know. I don't necessarily think it's, you know, a male only issue, as we talked about earlier. I think it's people under stress. But it's recognizing how do we do something different about that, and recognizing back to as you said, Dan, you know, almost in the silence, we are abandoning ourselves and what matters to us, our, you know, our values, our integrity, you know, our own sense of saying, actually, what I have to say, what I believe, doesn't actually matter, because all I'm doing is silencing in order for it to be easy within the organization, which just, I don't know, it just feels wrong. But I suppose, to Matt's point, there is a huge risk for some of speaking up.
And speaking up is always a risk, Laura, isn't it? It's always a risk. You're nailing your colours to a mast. You're putting yourself there to be shot at and criticised. And we live in an incredibly judgmental world, right? The four of us sat here, we all know that judging yourself and other people is fruitless and pointless and not a worthwhile exercise. You end up making assumptions, you end up labeling people, and you don't get to know who they really are and what they really think and what they're really about when you do that. But we live in that world where people make snap judgments. So it feels, inaction feels safer. Silence feels safer because I'm not putting myself up to be shot at. But like you said there, Laura, then all that happens is internally you're building resentment. You're getting angry. That's what men do. They get angry. They get irritable. And like you said, that's got to come out somewhere. So actually, we owe it to ourselves to be true to ourselves.
Yeah.
And if we have something to say, if we see something we don't like, if we want to stand up and be counted, we owe it to ourselves to do that. But, right, let's get it right here. We've got to understand, we've got to make sure we are in a place where we're not going to get shot down. We're not going to get annihilated. We're not going to get judged. We're not going to get put away. So that's where, again, the responsibility, individual responsibility comes to create the circumstances where people can speak their truth. We don't judge them. We don't put them away. Don't call them out. What was that phrase? The guy who did that course said, "Oh, connect before you correct." Right. So if you disagree with someone, build a bit of rapport with them first, and then have a proper grown-up conversation. Not like on Twitter or on Facebook where we all shout and scream at each other and you know, the loudest wins. You know, proper, nuanced, adult conversations.
It is so important that, you know, and I think the word that we've used a lot is, you know, and I suppose the conditions beneath all of this is about responsibility. It's about listening. It's also recognizing the consequence of us not speaking up. And I guess, I think what I hear from all of you is that silence isn't always a choice. It's more quite often a response to the uncertainty of the environment and the people around, and therefore it's like it's easier to remain silent as a result. But I think we have to recognize that there are implications for that silence to everyone around. So, you know, very conscious of time and with 1 minute to spare, without wanting to put the EastEnders to the end of this session. But I guess it's sort of one final thought from you all. You know, what do you see changes when there is, you know, the responsibility and the recognition that there is a safe space, or that the environment is safe enough to speak? You know, I'll start with you, Dan. You know, what do you see changes?
For me, right, when you create spaces where people feel they can speak up and speak their truth, I've created a men's community completely by accident, but it's a place where that happens. And what you see then is we all start to realize we agree more than we disagree. We want the same things. That's what happens when you create these spaces, when you create that psychological safety, when you all take responsibility to not judge people, to not put them away. That's what happens. People are able to speak their truth, and we realize that most of us share the same truth.
Yeah. No, I totally hear you, Dan. Mark, your thoughts?
In life, isn't it wonderful to feel safe?
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing. And what's amazing is how often we don't feel safe. You know, how many spaces where we actually can't be or express ourselves. But when we feel safe, then suddenly we can be open. Suddenly we can get out there. Suddenly we can really express ourselves in the way we feel we need to express ourselves. And I think that's the key to it. It's like Dan's saying about that men's group, you know, but when you get the opportunity to feel safe, when you know that there's not going to be that judgment of what you're doing, you know, when you know you can actually say, you know, this is what's right, then you can speak your actual truth. You can speak what's actually in your heart. You can actually admit to having feelings as a man, which is an incredibly dangerous thing to do in any shape or form, you know. But it means then that because we feel safe, we can get there. And if we get there, then we can actually call out things in the right way, because once that safety is created, everything blossoms from that. And like, here we are, and I think this is extraordinary that we're trying to talk about how we create a world to keep women safe, and yet we have to make men safe to do that.
Yeah. I totally agree. Matt, I'm sure you have something to share on that, because I think it's a very valid point.
Yeah, no, I think safety is critically important in this, and that's, as Mark's just said, that's male safety as well as female safety, because I think a lot of this violence and bad behavior from the men's side comes about because at some level that individual does not feel safe. So to come back to the question that you posed in terms of what happens when the conversation can happen, for me, the big one is learning. I learn by engaging in that conversation, things that I do that I thought, well, there's no impact on that. Or actually, maybe I do need to consider that. Maybe I need to think about that. Learning is the big one for me that happens when conversation flows.
Empathy just popped into my head there, hearing what Matt said. It builds empathy, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's back to your point, connect before you correct scenario. It's that building rapport, it's building empathy, building understanding. It's like, look, let's face it, we don't know what we don't know. So thanks as ever, guys. Looking forward to next month's. For those who are tuning in, next month will be at a slightly different time of 12:30, because some of us will be sitting in the sunshine with lots of water.
Endless supplies.
Absolutely. Anyway, I will love you and leave you all. Have a fabulous evening, and thank you for tuning in.
Thanks all.
Thank you.